It is my pleasure to introduce Charles Johnson, who is the president of the Southern Regional Council, and he reminded me today that we've known each other from years past, and I'm happy to have him here today. Please welcome Charles Johnson.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I want to welcome you to this 2016 presentation of the Lillian Smith Book Awards. You know, some of us can remember a time when a gathering such as this, where people of many races came together in the same social space, was highly improbable. The idea that things in the South could ever change or even should change was an idea that found very few voices. And one of those very few voices was that of Lillian Smith, whose writing during that period expressed impatience with those who thought of themselves as progressive and urged them to envision a very different South, a South which truly embraced the worth of all of its citizens. And so following her death in 1966, the Southern Regional Council established an annual award in her name to recognize authors whose work carries on the tradition of Lillian Smith, work of outstanding literary merit and moral vision, which honestly portrays the South, its people, its problems, and its promise. For the last several years, this award has been presented as a partnership between the Southern Regional Council, which originated the award, the University of Georgia Libraries, which house the Lillian Smith papers, the Georgia Center for the Book, which presents this fabulous Decatur Book Festival, and for this second year, Piedmont College, which operates the Lillian Smith Center in Clayton, Georgia, and which will host a full day of activities on Friday, September 30th, commemorating the 50th anniversary of the death of Lillian Smith. Now, there are many people who have had a hand in bringing this event to you today, but I want to bring special recognition to our jurors who worked their way through the 45 books that were nominated this year. They are Shanna Kiley, who is not here, Eva Laura Stevens, who is here, Earl Picard, who is here, and our chair, Mary Twining Baird. Won't you join me in saluting them? James Taylor. I always forget somebody. I thought I mentioned James Taylor, but last but not least, as they say. Last but not least, as they say. So we want to thank you for coming and hope you enjoy the presentation. It gives me a pleasure at this time to present to you, for the second year in a row, the librarian of the University of Georgia, Toby Graham.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Charles Johnson, for the leadership that you continue to provide for this for these awards, President for the Southern Regional Council. I want to add to Charles's thanks and thank Craig Ameson and President James Mellichamp from Piedmont College and Joe Davich and the Georgia Center for the Book. Also from the University of Georgia Libraries, I want to thank Gene Cleveland, who worked hard to help us to organize this event. Appreciate your efforts. You know, we think about public libraries, including the one that we're sitting in here today, as places of education and culture that are open to all, among the most democratic institutions in our society. Professor Knott helps us to understand that in the pre-civil rights America, and in the South in particular, there was a massive exception, as millions of African Americans were excluded from their community's white libraries. For librarians like Cheryl and I, we understand library segregation as undermining intellectual freedom in America's public libraries more than any other factor in the 20th century. But the history of segregation and civil rights in public libraries also has been a significantly undertold story in the larger struggle for social justice in America. Imagine barring citizens from public library, forbidding their access to the knowledge that they need to learn and to improve their lives solely on the basis of their race. So I was delighted, and hope you are, that our jury selected Cheryl Knott and her Not Free, Not for All Public Libraries in the Age of Jim Crow for a 2016 Lillian Smith Book Award. Dr. Knott is an associate professor at the School of Information at the University of Arizona. Her book helps us to understand how Southern public libraries developed in a pattern dictated by a segregated society and the ways in which African Americans pushed against the weight of institutionalized racism to create educational opportunities for themselves and for their children. Cheryl, I'm grateful to you for writing the book, and I am proud to award to you a 2016 Lillian Smith Book Award.
Well, I want to say thank you to the Southern Regional Council, to President Charles Johnson, to the chair of the selection committee, Mary Twining Baird, and to all of the selection committee members. This award means a lot. Sorry. That was the part I wasn't going to do. Okay, sorry. And I'm also just especially thrilled to be able to get the award presented by Toby, who has been an inspiration to me. His own work has on segregated libraries in Alabama has won numerous awards, and it's really his interest in the sort of shifting sands of information access that continued to motivate me as I was working on this book. And I also am especially pleased to be able to accept the award the same year that Dr. Morrison is receiving one of numerous awards for his books. I was happy when I read his preface where he talked about this massive work taking 15 years to do. My own work took longer than that to bring into print. And yet, in his 15-year time period, he also wrote, like another book. So, I need to get busy, right? I'm truly inspired by the people that I've met and who are involved in this book festival and this book award. I think of everyone here as readers. And when I'm writing, I think of scholars like Dr. Morrison and Dr. Graham, who have set a very high bar. And, so it's their fault it took me so long. But there's another category of reader represented by everyone in this room, and those are the people who are here at the Decatur Festival of Books. These are the readers who are committed to the life of the mind. And many, of course, are active public library users as well as festival goers. We love, those of us who use public libraries, we love to read and reflect and enjoy. But I think we may sometimes take public libraries for granted. We don't think of their histories, of their past practices and policies. The last time I went to the Houston Public Library to use the archives to do some double checking on some of the records regarding the Carnegie Colored Library, as it was called. The library was celebrating with an exhibit, celebrating the founding of the library. So front and center in this exhibit was a huge photographic print of the women who had taken a leadership role in transforming an existing private fee-based collection into an important public library in a major city. They were instrumental in securing Carnegie funds for a building and in convincing city officials to earmark tax money for maintenance of that building and the collection. The exhibit was in the lobby of the library between the front door that I walked in, the sort of outward-facing part of the library, and the archive where the records were stored and somewhat protected, somewhat hidden. The exhibit was in a position so that you had to walk through it to get to the archives reading room. And as I walked past this huge photo of these white women in the 1890s, to get to the archives, it struck me as ironic, in effect, that they stood between me and this archive, this hidden record. Now, there's no question that these women accomplished something significant and major. They created a municipal institution that still exists today that serves its community well, and that is important. And they did that 20 years before they had the right to vote. At the same time, I think they missed an opportunity, to put it in the most charitable way possible, to acknowledge and support a key American value, and that is information access. Their library, like so many across the South, including in Atlanta, was not open to African Americans. Houston's African Americans went 10 years more without access to a public library, and then lived 40 years with segregated branches and small collections. And it was at the initiative of African Americans that the library system finally desegregated. I grew up in Houston. I didn't learn that the library I grew up loving was part of a segregated system until I was in my 30s and had moved far away. In fact, it was a mention somewhere that set me on the path of learning more about this system, not only in Houston, but in lots of other southern places. As one of my colleagues said, I was attempting to do local history in a lot of different locales. But I think it's important to learn from the past, not only to try to not make the same mistakes, but also to help us think critically about our own practices and policies in the present. When I began this work, it never occurred to me that I would spend so many years trying to document and tell this story. And it never occurred to me that Not Free, Not For All would be given the Lillian Smith Book Award. So, had I foreseen that award coming, had I foreseen having this wonderful day, maybe I would have written a little faster. So thank you. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to the Southern Regional Council and your partners. I really appreciate it from the bottom of my heart.
My turn. Okay. So glad to see everybody today. I have the honor of introducing Professor Minion Casey Morrison, who has written this fine book, so packed with information that it will take you a while to take it all in. One man's hands can't break a prison down. Two men's hands can't break a prison down. But if 2 and 2 and 50 make a million, we'll see that day come round. We used to sing that one. You say Aaron Henry, and people reply, you mean Henry Aaron. Aaron Henry is one of the somewhat neglected figures of the civil rights struggle, human rights struggle, but one of the longest engaged and most effective soldiers in the fight. Aaron Henry was willing to spend his life hacking away at the prison walls until 2 more would come along, and 2 more. And he seemingly did the impossible thing, broke the damn prison down. And Professor Morrison showed how he did it and how much it cost him to do it. His was a lifelong struggle. And Lillian Casey Morrison gives us all the details of the endless fights as the forces against him and the Mississippians writhed and struggled to counter his and his cohorts' every move. Professor Morrison lets us see every twist and turn in the point, counterpoint of a life and death combat which holds our attention as it goes deeper into the human determination to achieve respect and the right of civil discourse. To quote John Dittmer, this book, represents a major contribution to the historiography of the civil rights movement. And I was talking with Professor Morrison during lunch about that whole issue of adding to the history of this and the recent history of the South, and how much we still have to learn about what took place and who was involved and what they did and why they did it. Professor Morrison has brought Aaron Henry to the notice and understanding of a broader audience, which has been a long-needed lesson in the opposite of the oft-heard statement about, my vote won't make a difference. Clearly, one man can make a profound difference. We are happy and privileged today to award the Lillian Smith Prize to Professor Lillian K.C. Morrison for his work in shining the light of his intellect on this hero of the human rights struggle who brought about such a profound change. Okay, I can put it back on the while you do your presentation.
Thank you very much. I wish to express my appreciation to the University of Georgia Libraries, to the Southern Regional Council, Piedmont College, Georgia Center for the Book, and the other sponsors who organize this event every year, and to the judges who selected this work for recognition, which I'm happy to be sharing with Professor Knott. Without libraries, none of us could accomplish any of these things. I am particularly pleased to have Aaron Henry's life and work associated with the profound contribution of a woman who exhibited Henry's type and range of leadership and courage in a time and place that was almost boundless in its denial of voice to African Americans and women. So I'm happy
to have an award that seems so appropriate in the way the lives of these two resonate. So I thank you very much for the honor, which owes everything to Aaron Henry for providing a story worth the telling and for composing a compelling life that offers continuing lessons for path to fundamental social change. For me, as a political scientist, perhaps it was foolish to undertake this task. That might have been best left to an historian, and there are great historians in this room today. Yet it was Henry's engagement with politics and his vision for political change that seemed right to occupy me. It fit with my scholarly work in comparative politics, mostly identified with the struggles to mobilize for political voice by repressed ordinary citizens in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. But what I learned along the way, in the 15-year lifespan of this project, as has been noted already, was that I had to employ a good deal of the craft of historians to pull it off. And your recognition gives me some confidence that I did it reasonably well. The story is there for your reading. I will say simply that this is a political biography of Aaron Henry, a man who was active in the civil rights movement in Mississippi from about 1952 until the end of his life in 1997. He was a leader of the social movement in the streets in the state. He was a formal political leader. He led the Democratic Party in the state and became a state legislator, and he was a major figure in Democratic politics in this country. In any case, the story is there for your reading, and I hope you will read it. So let me just say a word about the actual work and the man. Henry was that rare individual who successfully combined social movement and formal political leadership while maintaining integrity to the dictates of challenge and struggle inherent in social movement activism. His success seemed inherent in his original and enduring vision and method. He never separated social movement requirements from political activism, and seeing no disjuncture between the two, was able to carry them both along from the start. Even as his NAACP chapter in Clarksdale in the early 1960s challenged segregated bus stations, he simultaneously managed a campaign to challenge the lily-white Mississippi congressional delegation. No black candidate had run for such a seat since Reconstruction, when blacks were stripped of the franchise. He never wavered in that combined method and vision in seeking citizenship regularity for African Americans. The final point I would make about his life and contribution is about its longevity. That's already been noted, and the fundamental change that it made for. Now, in some ways, his longevity may have been accidental. Many people like him were murdered, harassed, and/or intimidated into silence. In any case, he lived a full life, notwithstanding monumental efforts to silence him, and maintained the good fight until a natural death. In the process, he gave leadership to the most profound social and political change for full citizen inclusion in Mississippi history. No one with a progressive social change project had his time in place or his endurance. For all that Mississippi was, is, and will be, the changes he wrought offer a template well worth holding on to. And finally, there's always the personal in doing a work that takes you 15 years. During this work, my own story endured the most profound changes imaginable. The life of my wife, Janetta, ended just as a project she also lived with for 15 years was about to appear. And so my daughter, Dr. Iabo Morrison, who's here, if you will raise your hand, she and I have picked up what is left and move along. I do so, in addition, with the most remarkable family of classmates, friends, and scholarly associates, several of whom are here today. I won't call their names, but it does me proud that you have come all this way to take part in this. It would take a long time to communicate the depth of support for classes of 1964 in Utica, Mississippi, and the 1968 class at Tougaloo provide me. I thank them as I thank you. I'm very happy to receive this award. Thank you very much.
Well, as it was said, we have time for some questions. If anyone has any questions for our authors, I'm sure they'll be glad to entertain them. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, with the public libraries, you focused on the South, but when there's segregated libraries throughout the country, I know you wanted to finish your work, so
Well, I do think, I'm sorry. Thank you for your question. I do think there is a story there to be told. And very briefly in the book, I tried to address that slightly. And I think the key, or at least part of it, is residential segregation. So this interest that librarians had in reaching out to communities and building branches so that people didn't have to always go to the main library downtown. It was a great idea on paper, and it works really well, except that as long as there's residential segregation that's enforced by city policies and ordinances, as well as practices, it makes the branch library part of the system of segregation. So I did look a little bit at some of the northern cities and what people were talking about, and there's an interesting dialogue about, on the part of white librarians, saying, you know, in northern cities, well, we don't have segregated branches here, but the Negro branch in this neighborhood. So that's why I think there's more to that story. So there is a difference, obviously, between the official and the actual.
But before you leave, please hand the product of the so-called segregated libraries. Did you pay attention to the relationships that the librarians who happen to have been African American made within their communities and the positive aspects? I became a librarian because of an African American library in Meridian, Mississippi, Carnegie Library, built on the property of my home church. So segregation isn't always bad. And so I'm wondering, did you see those positive aspects?
I did, and can I interview you later? Sorry. And, you know, in another 15 years, your story will come out, or 20 in my case. Yes, and that's one of the paradoxes about the story, right? Is that there's networking not only within local communities, but across communities among African American librarians who were meeting together sometimes on the campus of Prairie View A&M College or other places. So they were networking with each other. They were supporting their communities. They, over time, began to really build collections as the publishing world began to produce more books by and about African Americans. Those librarians brought those books into their communities. So thank you so much for asking that question, because it's a very important part of the story.
Yes, sir.
How are you, sir? As a young man, I was fortunate enough to know Aaron Henry and saw the pride he had when Mike Eston was elected to Congress. Could you comment a little bit, great remarks, look forward to reading the book, about his embrace of capitalism, the television station, and how he became an entrepreneur as well? We are in the home of Mayor Jackson, so it'll only be a little bit.
Well, that's an interesting part of his story, the entrepreneurship, and it goes back to the kind of household he grew up in. He was raised by an uncle and the uncle's wife, because his parents died when I think he was about 5. They were sharecroppers, but were intent on getting out of sharecropping and into entrepreneurship. And so they moved before Henry first goes to school into town. I almost said city, except there are no cities in Mississippi. They moved to town, and Clarksdale was a flourishing cotton town just off the Mississippi River, so there was significant wealth there, and it was possible to be an entrepreneur. And so his mother operated a beauty salon, and we all know what an effective opportunity for entrepreneurship that is in any community. And his father was a cobbler. And the story gets more interesting and complicated from there, because they were all imbued with a notion of entrepreneurship as they understood Booker T. Washington's model. And they were both influenced by it. His father was trained as a cobbler by people who had gone to Tuskegee, and his mother actually goes to Tuskegee for some education. She's unable to remain there, but they are imbued with this notion of entrepreneurship that was as complicated for them as it was for Booker T. Washington, by the way. The region of the northern delta in Mississippi where they lived was a part of a very successful and interesting entrepreneurial set of enterprises by black people. There was, after all, Mound Bayou, a black town that had been built by enslaved persons from Jefferson Davis's plantation. They'd come and built a black town, and it had very great hopes for a major economic engine for the region. So this is the milieu into which Henry is born. So he was a natural entrepreneur, he was a natural capitalist. He goes to the army, he goes to pharmacy school, and he starts a pharmacy business. But he is no ordinary entrepreneur. You see, his pharmacy became just a salon for the civil rights movement as it developed in that area. And his wife allegedly said it was a deal they made together when they married, that he was going to dedicate his life to social change, and that his business was going to be a part of that, and so it was. Now, he was an entrepreneur and a capitalist, but money was not personally important to him in the nature of greed in routine capitalism. And so Aaron Henry made money, but he didn't spend money. And so he wore frumpy suits and that sort of thing, and drove old cars, and that. And his acquisition of a television station which made him a millionaire was a product of challenging this television station that was the major media carrier in Mississippi, was because African Americans could not participate in that, and because they were not being portrayed, as he put it, as regular members of the community. So the object in acquiring the station, WLBT is what it was called, was not to make the tremendous money that accrued to him as a product of owning it. And he came to own it, actually, after challenging the license, because when he was a candidate, mock candidate, mind you, for governor of the state of Mississippi, they refused to give him airtime on the television station. And he says, well, hell, if I can't have airtime, I'm going to call you to account. He didn't mean that he would come to own it. But that was what actually worked out. It also explains the level of practicality in his approach to politics. But it is marvel that he could maintain integrity to this notion of progressive social change, even as he understood the practicalities of being a former politician and the sort of pushing and shoving and compromise that was required in all that. But he maintained integrity, and that's the extraordinary part of this story. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Just wondering if either of you ever ran across or have any thoughts about the Roosevelt schools and that movement that might have had any little connections or relationships with what was happening in the library.
Well, it doesn't relate to libraries, but it's very important to Henry's ability to get a secondary school education. In Mississippi at the time, there were very few places where blacks could go to a high school by the day. I mean, you've had the wherewithal to get to a boarding school if you could be sent somewhere. So that meant, in point of fact, that most blacks just didn't go to high school because there was no high school to go to. It's fortuitous that the Rosenwald and the philanthropic community built a school 5 miles from Aaron Henry, from where he lived and grew up. I mean, the accidental nature of something like that. There is a school that he's able to get to. So they play a very important role in Mississippi because the state was not supporting black schools. We all know this story. They were not supporting black schools at the level they were supporting white schools. But the African American community was forced to subsidize the schools that blacks did get. The churches that African Americans owned were the sites of African American schools. So they were doubly taxed to provide schooling for their children, and because of the paucity of what the state was putting in, the philanthropic organizations helped to build schools in these communities. So it's very important that in Clarksdale there just happened to be a Rosenwald school. Yeah.
Can I ask a question, a follow-up on that question? And your reference to the important Booker Washington to Mr. Tulu. Could you expound a bit on the relationship between Rosenwald and Booker Washington and the establishment of Rosenwald School, and to further ask the Booker Washington to establish and to pursue the creation of other schools similar to what he's doing?
Well, there are historians in the room that can do better in answering that question than I can, but there is a direct connection insofar as Washington are urging them to be sponsors. And this is one of the complicated things about Washington, who is misunderstood around the edges. Because when I was looking at the curriculum for the high school where Aaron Henry went, it was supposedly based to some degree on what white state officials presumed was the template at Tuskegee. And so there was some agricultural this and that, there was some, how to do farming and so on. But Aaron Henry also took chemistry and algebra and world history, and he read things that were absolutely subversive, like Richard Wright. He says, for example, which was banned in Mississippi at the time, right? He says, one of the most important pieces of literature for him was Richard Wright's Black Boy. Well, he's not supposed to be reading Richard Wright, for heaven's sake. So it was a misunderstanding about some of what Booker T. Washington was doing there, and I'm as critical of Washington as anybody else is. I mean, there was some of that was pretty messed up, but some of it was subversive stuff. And so in the collusion in trying to get philanthropists to buy into the school project was a part of Washington's mission of making the community self-sufficient, and not just plow, but plowing was a part of it. But I concede to you, I'm out of my depth here. I don't know, I mean, it's not in this story, and I don't know enough of the details. There are very fine ones here. My friend, Professor Carol Anderson, who may want to comment on this.
Let me I have a question, and it relates to something that was said earlier. Yes. I'm sorry. No, please.
Just a very quick note. Booker Washington was very important to the establishment of many libraries, and his book, Up From Slavery, was a critical text for both Andrew Carnegie, who learned about Washington's work that way, and also for Rosenwald, who learned about his work that way and became interested in his story. So I think he's remarkably important on many different levels, and he was also he was right there because his network was so vast. He was right there, for instance, in Houston. It was his intervention that helped create the library that was available for African Americans there. The first Carnegie-funded library building for African Americans was at Tuskegee. So.
last stand as it were. And I remember very distinctly as I walked to my segregated school, I had to pass that library that became known for vertical integration. And there was a historical marker reminding us that this was the home of the last Confederacy. I do not remember any use of libraries other than at my school. Later, the bookmobiles came around. But there was connection. That's the only access I had was to the school.
Well, just quickly, the Rosenwald schools were among one of the most important sites for libraries, and it echoes what Professor Morrison has already said, and that is the idea that this desire on the part of whites to use spaces that already existed rather than construct new spaces. So the Rosenwald schools became sites of libraries, particularly in more rural areas, and particularly in the late 20s, early 30s. So thank you for that comment. It rings very true.
Dr. Nutt, while you're here, could I ask you a quick question? I'm also product of one of those segregated systems, and I went to slave. I also grew up, the only library that I really utilized, they probably, I lived there, was in the school. But my question to you is, and maybe you can see this book, I look forward to reading it. In later times, another form of segregating readers was something that I encountered by librarians telling me, well, no, I don't have that. You can't use that. That's a reference book. Particular books that I was using. Did you find any of this, and have you addressed this in your book?
I'm trying to think about my book. Did I address? I don't know that I have an instance of that. Did I? Okay, then. Earlier today, I introduced myself twice to Charles Johnson. And he was very gracious and said both times he was happy to meet me, so thank you. I do know of cases where, particularly in the later times, when it was clear that the segregated library system was not going to stand much longer, where African Americans would start testing. They'd go to the circulation desk, they'd find a book, they'd see what would happen. And oftentimes they were told, well, there's a branch library for you to use, and you should go there. And if the person said, well, this book isn't at that branch library, they would be told, well, you go there and we'll send the book over. So what the kinds of things that you're talking about are part of a longer, I think we were talking about this earlier, more widespread practice of information access denial that involved, that put people in a situation where they had to use subterfuge or disassembling to try to get access to books.
So let me get my question. I've had the good fortune of working with the jury as they've gone through these books, and there are certain themes that you find common in a number of them. And a couple of years ago, we had a winner that was all about the movement in Jackson, Mississippi. And so it was very interesting to me when Dr. Morrison talked about the role. He almost finished his presentation, and then he mentioned Tougaloo College. And maybe everybody here is aware of the role that Tougaloo College played during that time, but at the risk that there may be some who aren't, could you share a little about the role that Tougaloo College played?
Well, you know, I can talk a long time about Tougaloo, and so I was trying to minimize because it's a very important place in my own life and my sort of being. It was known in Mississippi as Cancer College. It was one of the private black colleges that had always been known as an oasis in Mississippi because it was integrated in the early days mostly in its faculty. But the state forces were unhappy about a place like that. And so they tried desperately to remove the college's charter to operate. Now, just to explain how they could be so riled up about Tougaloo that they had dubbed Cancer College, Tougaloo was doing things like having integrated classrooms, sending people out to public demonstrations in integrated groups, and to speak of public libraries, had a group that was called the Tougaloo Nine, I believe it was a group of students who, in making the first stand that is going to become a street movement in the state, challenged the segregated library. And they, of course, are all arrested. And so Tougaloo was just a stain on and it was a place that served as a safe place. Now, being safe in Mississippi in the days of segregation was, you know, there is safe and there is safe, and not quite safe. We had gates beyond which we could take you, but we couldn't prevent bombs from being thrown at the college and shots being fired and so on. But it was seen as a safe space for movement people because it was where you could have that conversation. And we had an administration that supported those kinds of efforts. So when I arrived there in 1965, and this is at the tail end of the good stuff, I was going to a place where Martin Luther King had come and been received, where Stokely Carmichael had come and been received, where Fannie Lou Hamer had come and sang This Little Light of Mine, but also turned on that fire in her as an ordinary woman who was making an appropriate interpretation of her circumstance on a Mississippi plantation. So it was this place that really, one could say, was a movement institution. And it was a part of that richness that Willie Roy, one of my classmates who's here, and I shared as young people sort of coming into our own and learning to think about this place where we grew up and acquiring a commitment to change it. And Tougaloo was fundamental to that.
Can you join me in giving one last final round of salute to our authors today? We hope that as many of you as possible will join us on September 30th at Piedmont College for Lillian Smith Day. Between now and then, we thank you for coming, and have a good day.